Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you so much for joining us on this DecisionWise webinar that we have today. My name is Justin Warner, and I will be the host of today's webinar. Today, our topic is including the voice of the employee in returning to work. COVID has created some unique circumstances for us, and a lot of organizations are looking at what does returning to work look like. And today we're going to be talking about that and how important it is to have the voice of the employee in that process. I feel really fortunate today that we're joined by the CEO of DecisionWise, Dr. Tracy Maylett, and the president of DecisionWise, Mr. Matt Wride. So we brought out the big guns today. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Justin.
So guys, I know that your time is really valuable and we want to jump right in and get to this stuff, but I do have some housekeeping items that I need to take care of. So let me first go over a few items here. This webinar qualifies for 1 hour of SHRM and HRCI credits. So following the webinar, we will send out an email to everyone who has completed the viewing requirements with the particular code that will give you what you need for that credit hour. If you are watching this webinar on demand, and you need the credit code, please email me at info@decisionwise.com. That's info@decisionwise.com. Once you've completed it, I'll double check to make sure you met the viewing requirements, and then we'll send you out those codes. As I mentioned, this webinar is available on demand on our website or on this Bright Talk channel, and you can go back and watch that at any time. We often get asked, are we going to be sharing the slides? We don't share our slides, but you are welcome to come back and view the webinar at any time and fast forward and move around where you need to, so that you have the ability to reference those elements. During today's presentation, we welcome your comments and your questions. On the panel there is a question section. We welcome you to, throughout the webinar, feel free to ask your questions. We will try to answer as many questions as we can throughout the presentation. And if there's any time and any questions left at the end, we'll see what we can do to address those as well. If there are any unanswered questions that you might have, please feel free to email us at that info@DecisionWise, and we will get back to you as quickly as possible. Now, while the COVID restrictions are reducing, we are all still in separate locations, so we do apologize in advance if we happen to talk over each other. We hope here shortly that we'll all be able to be back in the same location doing these types of webinars. So now, with all of that out of the way, Tracy, Matt, again, really grateful for you taking time to do this, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Great. This is Matt Wride speaking, so you can learn my voice, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk about using the employee voice in returning to the office. Many times when we work with employee experience professionals, they are focused on a data event, like running a survey, doing something that's regularly scheduled. And this is a chance to use employee insights to help make a change management process more effective. So this is a chance to do something different with data and be part of a cross-functional team. So I'm excited to talk about this topic today, Tracy. We're going to get started. I'm just going to advance the slides here. The big question I think on everybody's mind is, are we ready to return to the office? And that can have a lot of meaning to that. Some people are ready to come back emotionally, but maybe they're not quite ready logistically to come back, or folks have moved states and they're not at all interested in returning to the office. I've just got some data from a recent survey that they've been conducting and kind of updating for pretty much the last year. This is sourced to the Harvard Business Review, but 32% of employees say they never want to return to the office. So nearly a third of your workforce is very happy, or close to a third of working from home almost exclusively. And it's polarizing because on the other side, rarely or never, you're at 20% or 1/5. So as you can see from this graph, the middle ground is sort of there, as distributed as you would expect. But I was sort of surprised by these results. Tracy, is this consistent with what you're seeing out there in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think this is very consistent, Matt. We're hearing, once you give the employees that taste of what that looks like, we're going to talk a little bit later about the concept of connection and adaptation. But one of the things we have to realize is that we've given this taste of what this looks like, and it almost, we'll talk later about this, but it almost appears as if we're taking this back away from them. So I think on this call, on this webinar, we have a couple of audiences. One is the audience that says, okay, we're bringing people back. How do we make sure that this is done in the correct way? And then the other audience that we may have on this call as well is wanting the answer to that question. Do we bring people back? And if so, how often?
Right. There are a lot of opinions. Some people are very excited to work from home and see how it works. We even have clients who are investing less in real estate and are embracing work from home almost exclusively. So you make a good point that there are a lot of audiences, if you will, of people and perspectives on work from home. And then obviously this big transition back to the office. One thing that's interesting is when we went to work from home, there was this sort of social reason. We all had a rallying cry to get behind. We needed to protect our families, our friends, our neighbors. We wanted to keep our businesses alive. So the change management process went really well in many respects because there was sort of immediate buy-in. But this is different now, Tracy. There's not this sort of unifying element, I think, like we had when we went to and work from home. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's an important point, Matt. Let's put our psychologist hats on for just a second. And what we're doing is we're saying we used to, when we first started moving to the work from home, as you pointed out very nicely, we were fighting against a common enemy. And we were all in this cause fighting against that common enemy. And because of that, we've marshaled all of our resources to be able to fight against that. And that was the reason why we did it. Now that common enemy is starting to dissipate a bit, then there may be employees who see returning back to the office as the common enemy. It's a shift that we have to understand there, that we're no longer fighting in this all together. And that may cause something to happen that may be different than we had anticipated.
And that really drives the reason why employee sentiment and perspective is important to gather, because you're right, Tracy. It's different now. We could assume a unified effort to protect all of us, and we can't make that same assumption because the sentiment is so different from worker to worker.
Hey, Matt, really fast. A tactical question that came in. Somebody was wondering if that graph that you had, if they also broke it out by any demographics. So
they did not. Okay. The study didn't. The article in which I sourced this from it was just recently posted, didn't source the demographics.
Perfect. Thank you.
Just what we want to talk about today is we want to review some overarching principles, and then talk about our purpose as really running the experience side of the change management process. How are we adding value? Who are our data audiences, and what information do they need? And then how will our project help the change management process? So I want to start off with some principles to consider. And this is where we're going to rely on Tracy's experience and background. Return to the office will be perceived by many as taking away a perk. You hinted at this, Tracy. Talk to us about this concept that you've called the adaptation. You've identified it as the adaptation principle.
Yeah, the adaptation principle is certainly not one that I coined, but it's been around for a long time. The idea here is that we tend to adapt to a particular level. So let me give you some examples. In the past, we used to be in the era of perks, and the race was to how do we out-perk the perker, and that was one of the ways that we brought on additional people. And then what happened is you bring in Taco Tuesdays, and everyone's very excited about that until they find out that the business down the street has Fajita Fridays as well, and then Margarita Mondays or whatever else may be the case. We tend to reach a certain level, and then we adapt to that particular level, and then we expect something beyond that. And when we're dealing with perks, that's the way that works. Well, working from home used to be considered a perk. And now, for many, that may be considered a right. I have the right to work from home. In fact, many of the studies that have been done over the last little bit identify that people will be more willing to work, willing to even take a lower salary if they're able to work from home. I don't know how accurate those are, but we see a lot of those studies that are being done. So what we're saying here is that now that work from home is no longer being considered as a perk. We've adapted to that. That's where we are. It's considered by many a right or something that is a privilege that we have earned, and that's where we need to be. And that's something we need to consider as people have adapted to this.
Surveys are a communication tool in and of themselves. You talk a lot about this, is that the act of surveying and what's on the survey sends a message. What do we mean by that?
Yeah, the idea here is that one of the purposes of this webinar is to be able to say we want to include the voice of the employee in how do we return, or do we return, or what does that look like, and what are some of the concerns that you have. So one of the purposes of a survey is not just to gather information, but in itself, just the fact that we're issuing a survey says something. So when we ask questions about, are you interested in X or interested in Y, then what that says is that's on our minds now too. So when we communicate, when we send a survey, it also sends a message that what we're asking for is possible. Think of that in terms of the survey here. If we have no intention of ever allowing work from home, asking the questions about their opinions from working from home sometimes sends the message that we are giving you an option here to consider working from home rather than returning back to the office. So we have to be careful about that.
Right. No, great point. We need to ask who are our new joiners, people that have come during this period, and what special considerations do they need?
Yeah, Matt, this is a big one. This is one that we really need to pay attention to, because we've even seen this in our office over the last little while as we've increased our workforce by 25, 30%. Many of these people have never seen the rest of the people in the office. And because of that, it's often very difficult to build a culture. So we need to understand that many of our new employees may be individuals who have never experienced our culture to the degree that they would have had they been in the office.
Where are your employees? Have you taken a census? Do you know where they're at? Have people moved? What are their near-term plans and long-term plans? It's kind of interesting to think that you've got to consider that people may be in different states only a few months later. The last one I want to talk about is correlating productivity to business metrics. Historically, we have looked at productivity a lot by time. Time has been a key variable or a key element of the productivity equation. And that may not necessarily be the case, and it may not be what is best measured in a distributed workforce or in a workforce that is working from home. And so you have to start asking yourself, can I measure things by ticket requests? Can I measure by other data sources that I might have? Can we look at calendars and get a sense of how people are moving through the day? If I manage a group of customer success managers or customer success representatives, maybe I just need to worry only about the number of onboarding demonstrations they're doing, or whatever the case is. So think about, as a data professional, how you're going to help your leaders correlate productivity to business metrics, and how you're going to measure that when face time and in the office time is no longer going to be as readily available, or a data point that you can rely on.
Matt, along these lines, I've been following a chain of thought here, a number of people that I've been seeing posting on social media, LinkedIn, et cetera. And many employees are saying, why do you care where I work from or what hours I work, so long as I get my work done? And employers are returning that with saying, well, maybe there's more work that needs to be done here. I just don't know that I can assign that to you because I don't know what those work hours are or what it is. So the ability to understand productivity here is going to be very, very crucial, regardless of whether we consider an entire workforce from home or partial or nobody.
Right. And for those HR professionals really trying to enhance their strategic value. Helping leaders solve this productivity measurement issue is going to be a really important value add on their part.
Oh, I would say this is absolutely a key level of value add for HR right now, particular paying attention to this.
Yeah. Tracy, talk to us a little bit about connection and what you perceive as COVID-19's impact on connection.
You know, this concept of magic came from many years of study, and of course, we wrote the book Engagement Magic about this. The idea here is that based on our 30 million survey responses at the time, we found that there were 5 keys that created engagement in people in what they did. Engagement isn't just I feel happy about my job. It means I also, as you just mentioned, the productivity piece, I actually do things about it. And we found that these 5 keys, when they're present, people tend to be engaged in whatever that is, whether that's work, life, marriage, whatever. The first one is meaning, and that's when my work makes a difference. I see a purpose behind it. The next one is autonomy. That's not anarchy. That is the ability to perform at your best and shape your environment in a way to do that. Now, one of the things that we need to be aware of is that for some people, maybe that environment is a work from home environment. We have to be aware that, at least in their minds, that autonomy may mean working from home. The growth component, am I being better today, developing versus where I was yesterday? The last one is the next one is impact, and you just mentioned that, Matt, the ability to see the results of our effort rather than just spinning our wheels. Then the final one, which is the big one here that we need to consider, it's connection. Connection is a sense of belonging to something beyond ourselves. That connection can take many forms. One form may be a social connection. I get to see the people in my office. I have to tell you, Matt, also, and you and I are two ends of the spectrum here when it comes to introversion and extroversion. I have a very strong preference for introversion. Yet I found myself over the last year just craving the ability to talk to somebody I'm not related to see somebody in the office, to talk to these individuals. And the sense of connection for many people is eroded on a social level, but also the ability to feel like they're connected to the organization. Right now, many people feel connected to a screen. Many people feel connected to a conference call, but don't feel connected as if they're part of that organization. They don't feel like they're integrated into that organization. You know, we've done a lot of research on this one, and it's pretty clear that just from a couple of questions on a survey, we can tell whether or not somebody plans on remaining with the organization. Over the past year, one of the things that we saw was that on our worldwide surveys, we found that connection took an immediate dive back in March, April of last year, when COVID really hit strong and people were forced out of the office. Connection took an immediate dive, but that started to increase again. And one of the reasons why that started to increase, actually be higher than pre-COVID levels, was because managers were being very intentional about maintaining that connection. We started seeing companies, rather than a once a year discussion, they would have a once a day discussion with their employees. We saw managers, rather than hoping to find somebody at the water cooler, they would intentionally reach out to those team members. And so for a period of time, about 2 or 3 months, we actually saw the levels of connection increase because we were being very intentional about it. Then that wore off a bit, and we stopped seeing these company meetings happening once a week or once a month, or the managers starting to reach out. And right now what we're seeing is a reduction in people's feeling like they're connected to the organization. So we need to understand that one of the valuable pieces of engagement is that ability to connect with the organization, whether it's the people or the mission or the tasks. And we're starting to see a decline in this one, Matt, and it concerns me. I get a little bit worried about that.
Well, it's a good example that when you are intentional about something, you reap the benefits. And it's easy to when you're around somebody and you're in the office and you see people, to think you've actually built connection. But the takeaway is that connection's built purposefully, even within the office. And I hope we don't lose those gains, as you said, Tracy, that for those organizations returning and figuring out a hybrid, that we don't just assume because we can see each other that there's actually a connection being built. And you and I both know that if we could choose but one question to ask, it would be a question on belonging. I feel like I belong here.
Absolutely.
Now we want to ask a lot more questions, but that of the magic model, connection is absolute. That is so vital to bringing out the best in people and getting that engagement that we're looking for.
I think, Matt, that is a key point of this webinar. The idea here that the connection needs to be established, whether it's out of the office or in the office. And we were very intentional about doing it out of the office for a short period of time. As we return employees to the office, or if we return employees to the office, that intentionality still needs to be there. And I think your example was a great one of, you could see somebody at the water cooler and think you've connected when you actually haven't.
Yeah, well said. So thank you for letting us cover those core principles. We felt it was important to get those out of the way because in some ways we encourage you to help your leaders understand these principles. And your job is to take the water to the end of the row. That's a metaphor from agriculture where we would irrigate crops by sending rows of water down the crop lines. Well, we're trying to get water all the way to the end of the row. Turning specifically to how do we use employee voice, our goal is to gather what we call experience insights. It's not to run a survey. The goal is actually the resulting insights from those survey and then get them in the hands of those that need the information. Not just publishing it and hoping for the best, but actually being intentional, there's that word again, of where those results land and how leaders can use them. And then we want to help employees feel heard. Tracy mentioned that this is a signal. And if we're prepared to ask these questions, then it can do a lot to promote a sense of collaboration and care about the employees. We want to inform those designing the change management process and that they're leading that process. And then we also want to use our data to understand how effective the change management process has been. How are things going?
Matt, would you mind if I got a little bit personal here and talked about a conversation that you and I had regarding this?
Sure, go ahead.
So Matt and I had this conversation a few weeks ago as we were preparing and thinking about the topic of the webinar. And, here at DecisionWise, we will have the majority of our employees will be back in the office. And that ability to talk just ad hoc or frequently on a regular basis and work together in ad hoc teams is very important to us. And so the conversation was had between the two of us, and Matt, you said something that really kind of struck me, and that is this first bullet point: help employees feel heard. And my thought on this one was related to a previous slide, which is, well, if we've already decided we're returning to the office, why would we want to ask employees specifically about what would happen? And you educated me on this one, because one of the things you said is, yes, they're returning to the office. That's decided for many employees, and we still have some remote. But you also said, I want to understand why is it and what is it they feel about coming back to the office so that we can resolve any concerns. And many of those concerns are going to be very valid concerns, and we need to understand what those are. So I learned I received an education that day, because I realized that, yes, if the decision's already been made, that's okay. But we need to understand what are those things that are in employees' minds as they come back here. So pardon me for that little tangent there, but you taught me a lesson.
I appreciate you saying that. I learned far more usually than I'm teaching, but I will say that, right, even if the decision's been made, empowering frontline managers to know, for example, that over half, if that's the case, are feeling like they want to be at home, then they'll know that that's how they feel, and they can come out and they can do a better job of hitting the why and explaining to them why we need to see you, why we want to be with you. And so you're right. It gives us a chance to tackle those underlying feelings. And if we don't, they just sort of sit there and they don't get resolved. I want to talk about data audiences. I believe we have kind of two data audiences in this project. First are the employees themselves, and they break out into promoters, spectators, and detractors. And then leaders and managers, they're the ones who are going to use the data from these. We're gonna ask the employees how they feel about things, their perceptions, their attitudes, their beliefs. And then we're going to try to get that information in the hands of the other data audience, and those are the strategists, those designing the return to office plans, the implementers that have to do it, the frontline managers, and then those that are managing the ongoing feedback process, as well as those that are there to help support and guide workers back. So I see there as being two data audiences. Any thoughts you have, Tracy, on things to look out for or suggestions you have for our audience?
Well, I like the way this has been broken down. And I think one of the key points here is that we do need to understand that we're not dealing with a single audience. We're dealing with multiple audiences. And because of that, we need to understand that even the messaging may be different, the needs may be different, et cetera. So as I talk to clients that are worried about this return to office, and their approach is, we will address everybody the same way. Well, it makes sense from a communication standpoint, give everybody the same message. But at the same time, we have to understand that we have on the left-hand side the employees in 3 different categories. Then we have our leaders and managers in 5 different categories, or even more. We need to understand that we're going to have different reactions from different people, different ways, and we need to communicate differently, a different message possibly to each of these individual groups.
Yeah. That's important. I think we part of designing good feedback programs is being clear as to your data audiences, and both those giving and those receiving the data, and how there's a connection between those two. I want to just quickly review some change management steps. And the reason for going through this process is to talk about where you, as the data professional or the experienced professional, can support the mission of the organization, and particularly in returning to the office. Number one, you define the change and align it to business objectives. So somewhere along the line, Tracy and I had to have a conversation of why we felt it was important to bring, as he said, much of our staff back. And we debated the pros and cons, but we ultimately felt that we hire a lot of really bright professionals, but they're fresh. This might be their first professional job. And we just felt like being together and connected in the training and the growth that happens in the in-between moments was so important. So we had to define the change, and then we had to align it to our business objective, which is we need to grow our people. They're reliant on us to really help them take those first steps as a professional. And so we that's where our alignment occurred. Our decision to bring them back was aligned to our business objective of developing people. We have to determine the impact. Who is impacted? What may be impacted? A process. Where is impact happening? Is it related to just one locale, and how? So someone hopefully has thought through that. Risks, resources, and responsible persons. Call them the 3 R's. And then develop a way to communicate what is happening and why it matters. So your survey is a communication tool. So make sure that you're helping, that you understand what the change management communication plan is, and then aligning the survey to help support that. Providing effective training and resources, implementing a support process. It's one thing to announce a change management, but if you don't give people a place to go during the change management process to get help or get questions answered, then you've got a breakdown. And then finally, you got to measure the change process. So this is just what we're dealing with as we think about organizationally how to bring people back to the office. Tracy, thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking of our own office here as we're doing this here, and because again, I'm learning as we go through this process as well. And that is, some of our folks, most of them will be back in the office, some of them won't. And we've made a very conscious business decision that some of our non-client facing individuals may be more productive if they're working from home versus in an office type setting. Well, that's great. That's excellent. Unless I'm one of those employees who wants to work from home and I'm brought back to the office. We need to understand that we need to be able to communicate with those employees, helping them understand who will be there, who will not be there, and why. How does that align to our business objectives, and how those are different? And we need to clearly communicate that rather than just assuming that they're all okay with it. We need to be able to very clearly say, this is why you're back in the office, and this is why those other individuals are not back in the office. By the way, those of you who are not coming back to the office, here's why, and here are the clear expectations, and then be able to provide the training and resources. We again, Matt, can't attack this as a single audience here. We have to make sure that we're addressing all of these change management steps to particular audiences.
And before we leave the slide, I think that as a data professional, you're going to be worried about bullet point number 2. You're very important in determining the impact. You're important to developing part of the communication plan, and then obviously measuring the change process. Those you'll be involved in all of them, but those are the big, as I see it, the highlights.
Hey, Matt and Tracy, really fast. We have an interesting question that I think fits into this this spot. So the question is to what extent are executives desire to have employees back in the office based off meaningful data versus any stereotypes that might exist about the workers? You know, so how does an executive, and obviously that's a very general question, and every organization is going to be different, but how do executives manage data versus stereotypes? I think it's a really interesting question.
Well, I'll just say this. Our goal at DecisionWise is to gather data insights to help leaders be data-driven in decision-making. And obviously, we rely on our perspectives and prior histories and experiences, but we want leaders to be data-mindful and data-driven. To the extent they are, I think it's across the board. I think there are some leaders out there who are relying on their gut, and I think others are being pretty careful. Tracy, you're close to this. What are your thoughts?
There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind. First of all, I think that many executives or senior leaders, even human resources folks, may be a bit surprised at some of those individuals who want to be in the office or not want to be in the office. I think there are going to be some surprises that are there. The reason I say that is because as I have an opportunity to talk to some of these folks at the higher levels of the organizations, they talk to me about how interesting it is that as they've started to open up a bit and allowed people to come back to the office, not required, but allowed people, some of those people that they thought would be the most resistant to these are the ones who are in the office at a desk in a cubicle or in an office every single day. So I think we may have some surprises. The second part of that is I think that's one of the purposes of the webinar here today is to be able to say, yeah, many of these decisions are based on opinion and not data. So go get the data, go find out about it. If you're assuming that one group of individuals may be resistant to this and another group may not be, you may be completely surprised. And the only way to find that out is to gather the data.
Yeah. There was a question just popped in. I saw, how do you measure change impact? A great question. And I wish I could give you a perfect answer, but I will tell you this, that as you measure, as someone who tries to understand the science of this, measuring observable behavior is a better indicator of change than measuring feelings. So as you design your questions, you should be focusing, if you want to understand if change has happened, then a question that says, my manager did a good job in explaining to us why we return to the office is one that's trying to get at the behavior, and that can help you get a better sense of how the change process is going. That's my answer to that one. So the next part of this till we hop into our question and answer period, I guess, is we want to look at some suggested questions that you might use in the survey process.
And Matt, as we do this, I want to make sure that we clarify that all of these questions may not be right for you or your organizations. In fact, as I look at these, there are some questions that I wouldn't ask here at our own office because they don't fit us, but they would be very appropriate for some of the the teams we work with.
And there could be more. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's designed to help you think about categories that you might want to ask about. And the first one is timing and sentiment. And these are all based on sort of a standard agreement scale. From strongly disagree to strongly agree with, and you can measure the top box or the top two boxes. When we say that, we're talking about 4, I agree, or 5, I strongly agree. But when should our organization return to the office? You can ask their opinion. The next one, I've made the necessary preparations. This one's an interesting question to us because it's talking about the logistics, not about necessarily about their feelings. Do you have daycare ready to go? Did you change locations? Is your body clock ready to come back? Whatever it is, You made the necessary preparations. And then the next one, I'm ready, I think gathers more of the sentiment of how I feel about, yeah, it's good, I'm committed, so on. I prefer working from home. You can ask this and you don't necessarily have to ask the other because they're binary. We're sort of seeing that either folks prefer to work from home almost exclusively or they prefer to be in the office. That survey we shared at the beginning kind of illustrates that. I understand why we need to return to the office. I'll be really interested to see results come back in from a question like that, and then I'm excited to return to the office is trying to measure, those real strong promoters. So think about how you're going to ask general sentiment questions as well as timing questions.
That second to last question, I understand why we need to return to the office. That's a golden question. I love that question. Because what it will do, it doesn't. First of all, it doesn't state that we're coming back to the office or that you have an option of returning to the office. But basically, what it says is, I've been clearly communicated with to understand what this is, and I've internalized this. So not only have you told me, Matt, that I need to come back to the office, but I have internalized the reason why it is important to be back to the office.
Yeah, and you could ask, I agree that we need to return to the office, but I don't think that's as good a question as I understand, because sometimes you may not like it, but at least you can say, I understand. This next section is questions, is maybe a pre-survey actually, or a separate type of data collection process, and it's things to ask the managers and leaders. And so I have the information I need to manage our return to the office, or senior leaders have clearly communicated their expectations. And you can see the rest of them. But I like the last one. If you have a policy, whatever the name of it is, if you're adopting a hybrid policy, which in some ways we are here at DecisionWise, we have a bit of a hybrid policy, even for those that we're bringing back. I understand our hybrid policy. Well, you can get a sense then, how has that policy, is it known as a concept throughout the organization? Are people, is the information getting to those that need to hear it? Is it being communicated appropriately? So that's what these could be. Just quick, someone said, would a better question be, I understand why they want us to return to the office? That might be a better question. I mean,
it's a great one.
Survey design is an art, not a science. And so I love that. You're right. That might be a better way. But asking managers and leaders and segregating your audiences is helpful here, because you can sort of, make sure that then you're reporting back to those in charge of the change management process and saying, hey, there's more work to do here because people don't understand our policy. Health and safety questions. So this is going to be interesting. There's a lot of sentiment about masks. That varies from region in the country. It varies by even political persuasions and things. And so you'll have to think carefully about asking these questions, but you may want to find out how people feel about masks. CDC has issued new guidance. So for those that are vaccinated, maybe this is a moot point, but these are interesting questions to ask. I am comfortable, or I feel safe. My organization cares about my health and safety. My organization has implemented adequate safety controls to allow us to return to the office. Can give leaders a sense of where people are at, and make sure that there's not something lingering in people's minds about why they wouldn't come back. That could be something that you could mitigate physically, using a protective equipment or some other operational tactic.
Let's talk about Herzberg hygiene factors here for just a second.
Sure.
In social psychology, the idea of a hygiene factor are those elements that do not necessarily cause us to be engaged in what we do. They don't motivate us, but the lack thereof, or taking those away, causes us to be dissatisfied or disengaged in what we do. Health and safety are certainly hygiene factors, in literally and figuratively. So what we're saying here is that these items aren't going to cause somebody to want to come back to work. But I tell you, the minute I don't feel safe in my office, it's very, very difficult to engage in anything else I do. So these are just some of the basics that we often forget. We just assume, and we can't make that assumption.
That's so true, Tracy. I mean, one of the big contributions from your book was that if you first have to deal with the satisfaction elements before you can get to the higher order engagement elements, meaning if someone doesn't feel safe or they're not getting their paycheck on time, all the other stuff you try to do, growth plans and all the other things we do to try to bring the best out of people, it just doesn't matter.
That's right.
And that's something that is a great nugget from, and I guess I'm putting a plug in for Engagement Magic, the book, but I think that's one of the big aha moments in that book is you got to deal with those hygiene factors first. And obviously credit to Herzberger for that. And then this is kind of an interesting thought, preserving the gains. I think that COVID-19 has introduced some technology that's really great. And even here, sometimes we'll find ourselves choosing to hold, even if we've got everybody in the office, which we have some people back to the office already in our state. It's been cleared. We'll still find ourselves doing a meeting over Teams, sitting in offices where we could gather in a conference room because it's easier. It's easier to share slides. It's easier to so there are a lot of things that we learned, and we don't want to lose those. So working with your IT team and others, you could also find out what went well during the work from home process. So you could list, for example, a list of tools and ask people to rank them or give them your top 2 or 3 technology tools that they really like, but also asking them where did they struggle. These are more open text questions, and so you're going to have to do some sifting and some text analytics work, but could really be a nice source of some interesting insights to help inform IT and others about the tools and resources people want and actually use. And then understanding why working from home was great. We may be surprised that it wasn't just snack whenever I wanted it or something. It may not be at all what we suspect. And in many respects, I know a lot of people felt like they were working more, but they were okay with that because they were suddenly in control of their schedule. What was the most frustrating aspects? What was your experience like? That's a really great one for sentiment analysis and, again, open text analytics. And then what aspects about working from home would you most like to keep? And that's interesting. Can we bring elements of the work from home experience to the office? I mentioned one about kind of choosing to use our Teams meetings when we're trying to collaborate, but there might be other things. Okay. Help tickets and support. Make sure you need to think about whether you want an open link for people to give continual feedback as you're in the middle of the process, where they can express frustration, or a ticketing system where if they feel like they need help or it's not working well or they just need to give feedback, they can submit a ticket.
And Matt, let's think of what we've been through for the past year here too, and what people have become accustomed to, and that is using technology to be able to provide feedback.
Right.
That's been more exacerbated over the past year than ever in the history of feedback. The idea that my feedback comes by way of technology. And so all of a sudden, let's suppose we rip that away from them and say, okay, by the way, you're supposed to be giving feedback to your manager on a regular basis. Well, hopefully that's fantastic and it works, but we've gotten used to this. So let's keep an option available to be able to provide that type of feedback.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as those that are HR professionals, you think about ways to resolve complaints. Do you need an ombudsman to deal with, when you're bringing a massive bunch of people back and they're suddenly in the same physical location next to each other, there are going to be some struggles, and do you need ways to resolve those? Just thoughts. But I do think this open link for ongoing feedback would be an interesting way of always having that available, so where someone could say, yeah, I want to give some feedback. Okay, some final suggestions. We want to kind of wrap this up with some before we do a formal Q&A. We're going to just run through these. So principle number one, make data a part of the change management process for this particular initiative and others in the future. And remember that you're there both pre and post. And raise your hand and become part of the change team. A good change management team needs to have a data professional there advising them and helping them understand the experiences that people are having during the change management process.
Matt, I can't emphasize how important this is. We make assumptions that these people will be okay to come back to the office, but these people won't. We assume that we've taken care of everything. And the basis of this webinar today is understanding the voice of the employee. Ask. That's how you get your data. Don't make these assumptions. And not only will you find out about sentiment, which is what you just talked about, but as you mentioned very clearly, it'll give us some concrete data about what are some of those points we need to be watching out for. What are some of those tools that are needed? How do I feel about coming back to the office, and where's there likely to be resistance? Get the data.
Yeah. I would invite, if you have a CX team, an IT team, to be part of your data process. Like start stepping outside of the typical HR group, and start becoming collaborative with others. You might find some really interesting tools that you didn't know that IT had, ways to do some ad hoc surveys that are already with your current IT systems, things like that.
So Matt, I want to put my HR hat on this one for just a second. And often we think as HR that we own the people component of the business, but we don't tie that to the customer component of the business, or the patient part of the business, or the student portion of the business. So to be able to invite our customer service folks and the IT team in to help us understand how keeping people away from the office or bringing people back into the office is going to impact the customer. What do I need to be aware of? What are some of those things that maybe I can help you be aware of when they come back? So form those teams. Talk.
Yeah. Third is distill and synthesize information. Your job is not merely to collect and present, but there is an element of good journalism, or what I call data journalism, and good data process that says, I've got to help. And there's some ethical issues here, and there's some, and you got to be careful. But remember that some data needs curating, meaning, and the reason for that is that you'll see in that sub bullet point, the whirlwind principle. People are, I think it's Franklin Covey talks about this, but the work is like a whirlwind, okay? And people are just like the Tasmanian devil. They're just whirling around. And if you try to throw a bunch of things at them, all of them are going to bounce off that whirlwind and fail. And you're just not going to get through. If you can get one or two valuable points, they'll penetrate the whirlwind, and they'll stick, and they'll become part of that process. So just opening up vast amounts of data, making a lot of dashboards available, giving them another login, and lots of charts and graphs. That's not always the best data visualization. In fact, the best data visualization sometimes remains a text. You had this number of people feel this way. It's just a sentence. Can sometimes be the most impactful way to visualize data.
What this also means, the synthesis, the synthesized information portion of this also means that one responsibility of human resources in this equation is not just to gather the data, but translate that data into something that will impact the business or not impact the business.
Right. Don't provide data unless you identify the problem you're hoping to solve. In other words, begin with the end in mind. Data for data's sake's great, but if your goal is how many gee whizzes or I didn't know that, if you get a lot I didn't know that, that's wonderful, but that's not the end of the story. What you need to hear is, I really need that, or I really needed that information, or that's going to be very helpful to me. Sometimes we've done this in the past. We measure our success as experienced professionals as, oh, I didn't know that. And it's like, no, I want to hear, oh, that's super important, and I know what I can do. And so that's, again, starting with the end in mind, and understanding the questions you're trying to answer through the data process. Use existing communication channels. I hinted at this, but it can be overwhelming to give people another dashboard, another login. So if you can synthesize information and send it through email or Slack or something, think about using existing channels. It's far more likely to be a successful delivery process. Sometimes it's to build confidence. You do a little nuggets here and there, and this is a good place to do the I didn't know that. But you're just sort of showing that you're out there collecting data. You're reminding people that you're there to help provide insights, and so really it's kind of a hey, I'm still here, and every once in a while you could send nuggets generally to a larger group about things that you're seeing in the data. I want to touch on this one. As data professionals, our job is to be the guide. We are not the hero. It's very tempting to want to be the hero. I do this all the time. I want to be the hero, but my clients are the heroes, and as those who support frontline leaders in businesses, they are the heroes. Our job is to guide them, to be the mentor, and to help them grow, give them the tools they need to be successful. But the business leader is the hero, and when we remember that, I think it helps us deliver value. When we try to compete to be the hero, then we lose the crux of our value proposition. And that is the end of our recommendations. Tracy, any last thoughts that you wanted to share with folks before we do a question and answer?
I just want to hit that last bullet point again. The idea here that really this is not an HR move. So return to office is not an HR move. The gathering of this data is not an HR move. We play a valuable part in gathering that data, synthesizing and translating that data. But the hero or the individual most impacted is the employee and the managers, the leaders. And the more that we can translate this into me being able to go to Don and saying, Don, based on what we're seeing here, you may have an issue here with people not understanding why it is they need to come back to the organization, come back to the office. How can I help you in this? Can I help you work up a plan to make this happen? And oh, by the way, have you considered some of these other options? But that leader is the one who's impacted, not human resources, and we need to understand that.
Yeah.
Great. Hey, Matt and Tracy, we do have some questions still left that we weren't able to address. So I'd like to get to those. But before I do that, the two of you were talking about the Engagement Magic components and about the Engagement Magic book. And forgive me maybe for just throwing this out there, but hey, everyone likes a good deal. I just got notified by the publisher yesterday, actually, that for the next couple of days, probably for a week, I think is what the publisher does, these little spiffs on Amazon, that book is available for 99 cents. So everyone likes a good deal. So if you're interested in that book, go ahead and go get that. And I'll put a link in the email that we send out for anyone that might be interested in that. So anyway, just a little plug since I got that notification yesterday. So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So the publishers do that every so often. And so we'll let the audience here take advantage of that. So on the questions, Matt and Tracy, one of the questions that came in is, how do you measure change successes? So is it something that is more about the people who have returned to the office versus those that resist? Is it some sort of behavior versus, sentiment that comes through? How are you going to measure the success, the change success of going? For example, if we have to bring the majority of our employees back to the office, how do we measure whether or not that was a success?
I think it goes back to the suggestion we had from one of our participants, which I understand why they want us to return to the office. If I had to measure success, it would be off of that question. Because just who comes back and the body count, well, that sounded morbid. The people staying at home and coming back to work, that's helpful and it's part of the story. But if people can accept the why and understand the why, I think then the change management process has been successful.
I would also like to add on that one, Matt. I think your answer is right on, and that's the first and most important piece. You also mentioned a little bit earlier, let's measure behaviors. So rather than just measuring sentiment. So if we do ask our employees. We do a survey before they come back to the office, then after it, and measure, do you like being back in the office? That doesn't do a whole lot good for us. But what we can do is we can look at such things such as productivity. We can look at attrition. We can watch things over the next little while. There are lots of different things that we can do there, but I would caution against focusing exclusively on sentiment.
The question I'm seeing here, Justin, you mentioned earlier about the data audiences. Could you talk to more about the 3 types of employees? What data is needed, especially for the detractors? The detractors, the data they need is the answer to the why. Because they have valid reasons in their mind for why they feel like they can why the work from home situation will work. And so in some ways, that group, identifying how many might be in that group, and then going to maybe a focus group style of data might be more appropriate. What I mean by that is you find out if you've got a large percentage of detractors, by asking them some of those sentiment questions, and then going to your managers and saying, hey, when you get back, I think it's really important that you have a session and you try to understand why they think it was better for them in a work from home environment. And I don't think we're ever going to solve all the problems. I don't think we're going to convince detractors. But what we need to do is show empathy and that they're heard. And that may be all we can do. But that's something we owe our employees. And that's part of, being effective leaders. I don't know, Tracy, you have any thoughts?
Well, I think my biggest worry about return to office in general, this is not here necessarily, but everywhere else and here, is the idea of losing that intentionality. So we realize that intentionality in terms of communication and gathering feedback and talking to people and focusing. When we really focused on it, even though we were remote, we saw huge increases in engagement, and we're losing some of that intentionality. So one of the things I would say is that managers need to make sure, the leaders of the organization need to make sure that we're not just assuming things are going to resolve themselves, assuming that employees are okay with this, assuming that some people are not okay with it. We need to be very intentional about our communication, especially with the detractors. We need to understand why. We need to focus. We need to be intentional about our feedback. We need to be intentional about our interactions and praises and et cetera.
Tracy, will you continue to talk about that a little bit? So you have an executive level or an organization that might be creating a strategy to help with this, but the impact of that frontline manager, that individual manager, and what an impact that they make, and making sure that those, we don't have any expectation misalignment between the organization and that manager, and that impact of that manager on engagement.
Well, there are a few stages in there. First of all, the organization and the manager need to be aligned. So it needs to be very clear that these employees are coming back, these employees are not coming back, here's what's expected, et cetera. So that alignment needs to take place. And so one of the things that HR can really help with is make sure that the alignment between the organization and the manager is very clear. But then what happens is the manager also needs to align with the individual employees. We find that when we do organizational studies and surveys, that the organization itself has actually a very minor part in whether or not an employee is engaged in his or her job. The manager the organization can only impact that lever just a little bit. But the manager, that relationship with my manager is extremely key to my level of engagement. So the ability for a manager to be very intentional about that communication with the employee and the feelings of that employee is absolutely critical to make this happen. One of the things that HR can do is help those managers understand how to do that and that importance.
And I just would add too is, if you're going to do alignment, don't just do general alignment. Don't say things to your managers. Tip number 1, make sure you consider your feelings of your employees, or have a conversation with your employees. Go deeper than that and say, we expect you to have a one-on-one with each employee to talk about their return to work transition. Now, think about that. That's a behavior, and that's a behavior I can track and ask, did you have a one-on-one conversation with your supervisor about the return to office process? And now I have a behavior that I'm tracking. So again, the more specific you can be with behaviors that are helpful, the better off you are, because sometimes we just throw out things like, well, you need to talk to people and help them manage the change. Instead, little more specificity can go a long way.
Yeah, that's great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for the time today and the great information that we've had here. Been very insightful. Again, to everyone that's on this webinar, will be on demand that you can go back and watch, fast forward, rewind, see the slides, take screenshots, whatever makes sense for you. As I mentioned, I'm going to put in the email for those who have completed it, the HRCI credit codes and the SHRM credit codes for those who have completed it, as well as based off of our conversation, the link to that Engagement Magic ebook that the publisher is putting on sale over the next week or so. So anyway, thank you all for being a part of us. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Tracy, for the time today, and catch us for our next webinar.
Thanks, Justin. Matt, thank you.
Thanks.